Ready.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Brazil Center at LILAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our talk this afternoon with Dr. Henrique Kuckerman. He's a professor and science and technology studies researcher at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, with affiliations in the systems engineering and computer science department at the Alberto Luiz Coimbra Institute for Graduate Studies and Research in Engineering, the graduate program in the history of science and techniques and epistemologies, and the Computer Engineering and Information Department at the Polytechnic School in Rio de Janeiro. Dr. Kuckerman is the author of Yes, We Have Pastor, Manguinhos, Oswaldo Cruz, and the History of Science in Brazil, published in 2007. He has held visiting positions at Stanford University, the Deutsches Museum, the Universität Konstanz, with support of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and here at the University of Texas, he was the Fulbright Chair in Brazilian Studies in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Professor Henrique Kuckerman.
Well, thank you. Thank you for, I thank the LILAS Benson Brazil Center for the invitation to this talk. With my special thanks to Professor Seth Garfield. Thanks also for the support of Paloma Diaz. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. My talk is based on an article of mine recently published in the Dictionary of Latin America History from Oxford University Press, entitled The Vaccine Revolt of 1904, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I will present here a shortened version of this article together with comments addressing differences and similarities between vaccine and anti-vaccine movements then and now. So in 1796, the British Dr. Edward Jenner demonstrated that an infection with the relatively mild cowpox virus conferred immunity against the deadly smallpox virus, thus announcing the vaccine against smallpox based on the inoculation of cowpox. The requirement of a mandatory smallpox vaccine in Brazil, enacted by the Congressional Law of October 31, 1904, sparked the popular uprising known as the Vaccine Revolt that swept through the city of Rio de Janeiro, then the federal capital, from November 11 to November 16. One important remark about the effects of mandatory vaccination is that organized public opposition in the form of anti-vaccination societies sprang up in England and America just after the introduction of legislation for mandatory vaccination during the mid-19th century. So for Brazil, doctors in charge of public health in the very beginning of 20th century, fighting smallpox has had a simple solution: just make the vaccination mandatory. No attention was given to the public mood, nor to the fact that this ingenious solution had been opposed by anti-vaccination movements that were as old as the earliest days of the vaccination itself, as you can see in this cartoon. Let me share okay. As you can see in this cartoon here, I hope you are seeing it. This cartoon is by James Gillray, it's by James Gillray in the beginning of the 19th century, more exactly 1802, entitled The Cowpox, or the Wonderful Effects of the New Inoculation, expressing harsh objections that were made on both medical and religious grounds, condemning vaccination as a dangerous and unsanitary procedure involving the forbidden mingling of animal matter with human flesh. You can see in the cartoon cows sprouting everywhere, and even facial features distorted to resemble that of an ox. 2 centuries later, in the beginning of 21st century, we testified the same kind of opposition to vaccination in a protest last week, in the City Council of Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, against the promulgation of a municipal law imposing the vaccination certificate to circulate in the city. Pay attention to the swastika in principle, associating imposing vaccination to the Nazi regime. So now back to the century, in the middle. Oh, yes. The beginning of 20th century, when Rodrigues Alves, a member, I have to share it again, my screen. maybe I let it a little bit on the sharing, so I just need to toggle between, let me see here, yeah. So Rodrigues Alves, you can see in the slide, the member of the São Paulo coffee planting oligarchy, had become the country's president on November 15, 1902, promising to modernize the country's capital to make it a gateway for foreign investments, goods, and workers, with sanitation and urban reform in Rio de Janeiro his top priorities. Led by the capital's appointed Major Pereira Passos, the urban reform included renovation of the docks to make them longer and deeper, and the dismantling of the colonial-era network of narrow streets around the port. As part of the city center's renovation, an operation known as the Bota Abaixo, or the Great Knockdown, demolished the tenements and shacks occupying numerous downtown city blocks, dislodging thousands of people to make way for grand avenues and widened streets. Oswaldo Cruz, one of the greatest figures in the pantheon of Brazilian science, was appointed by Rodrigues Alves on March 23, 1903, to command the DGSP, the General Directorate of Public Health, based on his commitment, together with his team at the Federal Serum Therapy Institute, inaugurated on July 23, 1900, to eradicate within 3 years the three main diseases that threatened the health of the federal capital: the plague, yellow fever, and smallpox. As director of the DGSP, Oswaldo Cruz convinced Congress to approve his proposal for a new public sanitation code, which was regulated by a decree of August 1903, but without a mandatory smallpox vaccination, as that aspect had met parliamentary opposition. So, yeah, I think it's better to leave all the time. It's difficult to toggle between both. Let me share here. Okay. So, without a mandatory smallpox vaccination, as that aspect had met parliamentary opposition. Note that in 1903, the Brazilian government was for the vaccine, while now Brazilian government had an anti-vax position, proposing instead early treatment with hydroxychloroquine, and only later turned to vaccines after being hardly pressed, but still indicating the early treatment. In 1904, the DGSP insisted once more on its vaccination proposal to Congress, which finally approved smallpox mandatory vaccination on October 31, 1904, despite strong resistance from within and outside the legislature, led by some members of the press, discontent army officers, working class leaders, positivist leaders, and monarchists. Republican regime had recently begun in 1889. This opposition alleged reasons ranging from the risk of vaccines being contaminated with other disease to the liberal principles of autonomy and freedom of individual choice in their opposition to a government-imposed mandate. So the reasons to oppose vaccination then and now are basically the same: the contamination of vaccines and the liberal positions against the violation of privacy imposed by the state. It is noticeable that, one, the liberal argument nowadays has been also appropriated by far-right discourse. Two, we are almost 120 years ahead with much more accumulated knowledge about vaccines, immunology, infectious disease, and public health policies, even though the arguments are the same. So once the law imposing smallpox mandatory vaccination was approved, the task of implementing it through regulations remained. An extraordinarily rigorous set of regulations was drafted by Oswaldo Cruz himself, without an officially printed vaccination certificate issued by a public health official. One could not enroll in school, get married, be employed in construction, sales, manufacturing, or domestic service, buy a ticket for interstate travel, hold public employment, vote or run for office, enlist in the National Guard, or even stay at a hotel, among a list of other prohibitions. This was the sequence of events as portrayed by opposition's cartoon. So, Congress approves the mandatory vaccination law. The word people appears on the trousers of the kneeling man, and Congress appears on the clothing of the standing man. The caption reads, mandatory vaccine, followed by Congress saying, choose. Rodrigues Alves signs the regulations implementing the law drafted by Oswaldo Cruz. The cloth over the table reads, the tomb of liberty, and the caption says, go on, sign it. And finally, the cartoonist foresees the events that would soon occur. The title reads, War Against the Mandatory Vaccine, and the caption says, Oswaldo Cruz, the Napoleon of the syringe and lancet. The newspaper A Notícia immediately leaked the regulations, which hit the city like a bombshell. Contemporary newspapers' accounts of the events were dramatic, such as this one, quote, the people reacted ferociously, losing bullets and stones, fleeing, falling back, advancing once more, falling wounded or dead. Volleys of gunshots thundered through the air, mowing down countless victims. A boy fell dead on the sidewalk. The following Monday, November 14th, the same devastating scenes of blood running in the streets, people falling dead and wounded, unquote. The rebels fought with wooden stakes and iron bars wrenched from the urban reform sites. Several trams were overturned or set afire, and at one point, even sticks of dynamite were used. In the report made by the chief of police, we can read the accusation against the revolt's supposed leader, quote, they could not rely on the support of the people, but only on common criminals, the outcasts and feces of society, unquote. The accusation referred to the meeting at which the League Against Mandatory Vaccination was founded on November 5, 1904, where Vicente de Souza, professor, physician, abolitionist, socialist leader, and one of the founders of the League, addressing a crowd of 2,000 people, warned that the vaccination of women would put working class families in an embarrassing situation. Quote, upon returning from work, the head of the household would be unable to know for certain that this family's honor was still intact, as a stranger would have penetrated the domicile armed with the legal proclamation authorizing him to invade the household and brutalize the bodies of his daughters and his wife. The prostitute gives herself to just anyone, but the virgin, the wife and daughter, will have to bear their arms and bodies to the vaccination agents, unquote. After almost a week of intense conflict on the streets, the vaccine revolt came virtually to an end on November 16, when the government took two crucial steps to stem it. It repealed the obligatory nation of the smallpox vaccine, and it declared a 30-day state of siege in the federal capital to put down the remaining rebels. According to the historian José Murilo de Carvalho, the anti-vaccination arguments drew on partially, poorly, or selectively absorbed ideas imported from Europe, resulting in a hodgepodge of liberalism, positivism, socialism, and anarchism that appear, quote, in the most bizarre versions in the speeches and actions of the most unlikely people, unquote, as in the case of the actual Brazilian resistance to vaccination, except for the fact that now the ideas were imported from USA. So the anti-vaccine movement was mainly sustained by the orthodox activists of positivism. This argument had a local flavor, but drew extensively from the international anti-vaccine movement, especially from its roots in England, and were reinforced in all positivist leaflets. Once more, anti-vaccinism had been already in the game. In opposition to Louis Pasteur's microbial theory, recently brought to Brazil by Oswaldo Cruz and his cohort, the positivist explanation for the epidemics was partly based on the cluster of explanations inspired by what Bruno Latour calls old hygienism, fashioned out of the, quote, accumulation of advice, precautions, recipes, opinions, statistics, remedies, regulations, anecdotes, case studies, unquote. Positivist epidemiology covered a wide range of provisions related to public health and the intimacy of private hygiene, which prescribed family life, amiability, joviality, resignation, adherence to a strict moral code, well-ventilated housing, fresh air, cleanliness in one's person and one's home, and an appropriate and sober diet free of stimulants, especially alcohol. And because the prophylaxis promoted by the GSP was considered a factor that could lead to epidemics, positivists recommended that people avoid taking the vaccine or any sort of serum. The same accusations to vaccinations then and now. Teixeira Mendes, a positivist leader, added an interesting argument, quote, "Our problem results from the general state of our bourgeoisie, which models itself on the French bourgeoisie. This is the situation that actively urges us to make a change, continually appealing to the qualities of heart, spirit, and character that we have inherited from our knightly ancestors." Unquote. For the positivists, Brazil should embrace its Siberian roots and not to be ashamed of them in comparison with the supposed intellectual and material superiority of Northern Europe. There is evidence that some sectors of the oppositions had been plotting a coup against the government since 1903, particularly among the two groups. The first was composed of military officers with links to the forces that led the first two Republican administrations, featuring young officers recently graduated from the cadet academies where they had been indoctrinated in the tenets of positivism. The civilians among this group came from urban social sectors, especially public servants, the liberal professions, small entrepreneurs, and employed university graduates and owners of the tenements buildings that had been closed or demolished by the urban reforms, who saw the statizing nationalist, pro-labor, xenophobic discourse of the cadets as their salvation. The second group of conspirators who secretly provided financial backing to the first group were monarchists who had been deposed by the new Republican regime. The chaotic state brought about in the city with the insurgents' occupation of the streets seemed to them the perfect opportunity for a military coup that began late on the night of November 14th, but miserably failed. So as in 1904, we still continue in Brazil under huge interference and menace from the military. Another front in the vaccine revolt drew the attention of the press. In the poor downtown neighborhood of Saúde, barricades were thrown up and the common people, led by Horácio José da Silva, black band nicknamed Prata Preta, which translated should be Black Silver, resisted the onslaught of the government troops. Prata Preta took on legendary proportions as a symbol of the last bastion to succumb to the siege that the Navy and Army laid to the neighborhood on November 16, 1904. The order was to annihilate the resistance in Saúde, even if the Navy had to bombard the neighborhood after the crew of one of the Navy's ships had been disembarked and several shells had been fired, routing the defenders of a reinforced trench built there by the mutineers, the popular resistance was finally put down. The moments leading up to Prata Preta's arrest by government troops, as recounted by one newspaper, left no doubt about the fearless warrior's courage. There was an intense exchange of fire between mutineers from Saúde and government's forces, and according to a newspaper, quote, "In the midst of the tumult, there emerged a tall, well-built black man with the courage of a veritable beast. Only after a tenacious and blind struggle was the fearsome black man taken prisoner," unquote. Even wounded, it required great effort to drag Prata Preta to the police headquarters, where he, quote, "broke out in curses at everyone and could only be restrained with the help of a straitjacket," unquote. So what moved Prata Preta to openly confront such a powerful enemy? There is no obvious response because there is no record of any hearing, investigation, or anything similar, as a 30-day state of siege was declared for the federal capital on November 16, giving the repressive forces free rein to simply jam everyone arrested on the streets into prison. One newspaper's account of the final episode of the vaccine revolt described the rebels' banishment in late 1904 to the Brazilian distant state of Acre under horrible conditions. Quote, the 334 convicts, practically naked, rolled around on each other, bruising themselves, sleeping in the sickening slime of feces and vomit, unquote. Who were Prata Preta's companions in the popular resistance? The available evidences do not reveal which segments of the population participated in the revolt and in what proportion, much less how their participation was coordinated, if at all. The acute perception of the vaccine revolt, published by the famous Brazilian writer Lima Barreto, perfectly illustrates some of the difficulties to its understanding. Quote, the revolt has no face, no form. It is improvised. It propagates, it spreads, but it doesn't bind. The group that operates here has no connection whatsoever with the other groups shooting there. They are independent. There is neither a general leader nor an established plan, unquote. Lima Barreto's words puts very clearly the historiographical issue that the revolt should not be treated in an overly simplistic manner as a structure subjected to some form of regulation from which its dynamics could be explained and its root causes identified. So let's have a look on some analysis. The first of them sought to explain the revolt as emerging from a set of propitious circumstances described as ongoing popular dissatisfaction with aggressive incursions carried out by hygienists and police against poor-class housing, as you can see in the slide, and even places of worship where Afro-Brazilians were accused of being witch doctors. This panorama of the city's transformation can help one to understand the revolt, but cannot account for the historical details because contextual panoramas lack specificity and materiality. In view of the wide diversity of participants in the vaccine revolt, José Murilo de Carvalho said that, quote, despite being ignited by a single fuse, it was a fragmented revolt as Rio's society was itself fragmented at the time, unquote. But the earliest analysis, one more explicitly than the others, reduced the fragmentation to two major blocks, the popular revolt and the military revolt. In his book, The First Republic, 1889-1930, the historian Edgar Carone, to his credit, acknowledged some asymmetry between these two revolts. Quote, the year 1904 is known for the military school revolt. Although this event is important, the popular revolt is more significant, unquote. But if these two or three revolts did exist, they cannot be placed on equal footing. There is an enormous asymmetry to this supposed duality, which had been perceived much earlier and more clearly by the engaged sensitivity, once again, of Lima Barreto. Quote, this revolt had major advantages. One, it demonstrated that Rio de Janeiro could have an opinion and defend it by force of arms. Two, it slightly reduced the fetishism of the uniform. Three, it demoralized the military school. For the first time, I saw people unafraid of a man in uniform. Like the Aztecs in the time of Cortes, the people realized that they too were mortal, unquote. More recent analyses published since the 1990s have sought to parse out the motives for the revolt by looking at its popular protagonists. But no documents has yet come to light that record the rebels' own voices. To overcome the challenge of scarce documentation and carry on the search for the people's speech to decipher the possible motives behind the vaccine revolt, more recent historiographical studies have undertaken a kind of archaeological effort based on traces of popular writing whose syntax should necessarily be verified outside the written record. An example is the route José Murilo de Carvalho took in proposing that, quote, in the absence of written documents that allow us to deduce the rebels' motives, we must rely on the language of the revolt itself, especially the language of action, which often reveals more than the language of words, unquote. Working from the assumption that Black people harbored fondness for the monarchy, Here, José Murilo de Carvalho speculates that the events may have been due in part to popular antipathy toward the new Republican regime. He backs up this argument by pointing out that if the recession had lasted for the entire administration of the previous president, Campos Salles, the economy was in full recovery under his successor, Rodrigues Alves, and even offer opportunities for employment in the capital's urban reform. He also challenges the idea that the revolt was motivated by this reform, observing that, quote, popular wrath does not seem to have been directed against the urban reform of the federal capital. Pereira Passos, the major, and Paulo de Fronten, the engineer, were spared. The workers' manifestos do not mention them, nor do the popular actions seem to have targeted them, unquote. The main cause was to be found for José Murilo de Carvalho in the, quote, country's first successfully public publicity campaign against the vaccine, unquote. And more specifically, its moralistic tone, emblematically manifested in Vicente de Souza's defense of women's honor, as we have already heard. That moral affront, that moral affront makes the author believe that the scope and depth of the vaccine revolt lie precisely in the issue of moral justification, considering it, quote, an almost unique example of success in the history of Brazilian popular movement in defense of citizens' rights not to be treated arbitrarily by their government, unquote. Sidney Chalhoub's analysis, another historian, Sidney Chalhoub's analysis, forges a new and extremely original path, taking issue with the view that the common people always react, always resist, they never act. That is, one never knows exactly how their historical experience, ways of understanding the world, or life circumstances would positively inform the movement that fought against the vaccination, unquote. Chalhoub proposes to analyze the revolt based on the long-standing history of fighting smallpox, examining the Afro-Brazilian concepts of diseases and their cures, focusing on the case of smallpox and its particular divinity, its Orixá, Omulu, or Obaluaê. His conclusion, quote, perhaps we now know the source of the horror. Hindering this divinity's actions could result in greater devastation and death, unquote. Thus, rather than a struggle between knowledge and wisdom on the one hand and superstition and ignorance on the other, in fact, a confrontation between two forms of knowledge was maybe at the root of the vaccine revolt. Nevertheless, Chalhoub does not clarify what portion of the population were devotees of the rituals of Omulu. Therefore, it is impossible to know to what extent the revolt was carried out on behalf of that Orixá. In fact, it is Chalhoub's research that poses the question, quote, are there any conclusive witness accounts that the devotees of Omulu in Imperial Brazil practiced rituals involving variolation? The answer is no, unquote. Probably, large-scale adoration of Omulu and the consequent widespread practice of the variolation ritual before the Orixá would have left deeper marks on the skin of urban life. So, coming back to women's bodies, let's read a passage from the speech given to the Federal Senate by Rui Barbosa on November 16, 1904, in favor of the declaration of a state of siege as requested by the President of the Republic. Quote, the action of the state can only reach as far as the skin that coats our bodies. Its police can grab me by the collar of my jacket, chain my wrists, shackle my feet, but inject its medicinal drugs into my veins in the name of public health, that it cannot do, no matter how harmless they may be. The medicine of my body, like that of my spirit, belongs to me alone, unquote. Once more, we are in face of the same liberal argument then and now, even considering that the culture of advanced technology has made it impossible since the mid-20th century to clearly delineate the separation between the natural human body and the human body rebuilt by the artificial intervention of technoscience, as proposed by Dana Haraway in her Cyborg Manifesto, quote, why should our bodies end at the skin, unquote. Upon this body defended by Rui Barbosa, conceived so broadly and generically ready to receive the most noble meanings of liberal thought, there is also another one, also generically conceived, the body of the woman, whose modesty was to be protected. It is worth noting once more the inflammatory speech by Vicente de Souza on the eve of the vaccine revolt, in which a woman's body emerges not exactly as a female body, but more properly speaking, as a man's property, subordinated to the head of the household, to whom she must delegate her public voice, as she should resign herself to the silence of the household. This is quite evident in this cartoon entitled The Vaccine. In the caption, the man on the left says to the other, "I swear that's how I am. The first man to put his hand on my wife's arm, I'll kick him in the face." So what does the vaccine revolt have to do with the vaccine? Almost all of the analysis of the episodes were based on the hypothesis that the vaccine played only a minor role, that the revolt had little or nothing to do with the vaccination itself. It is therefore not going too far to say that in its historiography, the vaccine revolt almost always appears as the revolt without vaccine. What seems to be a mere game of words turns out to provide another historical approach in Robert Narman's article, Positivism and Revolution in Brazil's First Republic, the 1904 revolt. The vaccine is deliberately excluded from its title. Compared to more political important factors, the vaccine had to give way to a date. Quote, "Vaccination was merely superficial to the revolt," unquote. One could not be clearer. It implies there is a hidden motive that scholars must decipher, since at the surface of the events, the vaccine was merely a simple pretext. By seeking to contextualize the vaccine with speculations about what political, social, and economical factors were the real motives for the revolt, this analysis implicitly or explicitly endorsed the authority of science embodied in the vaccine's efficacy. A renewed understanding of the vaccine revolt requires that the vaccine be reinserted into the revolt's history, along with the very apparatus of technoscience that gives the vaccine its authority and legitimacy. It is therefore necessary to vaccinate the vaccine revolt by recounting its history also as part of the history of technoscience. Just a little bit water. We could then begin with Edward Jenner and his observation of a popular, this is by the end of 18th century, and his observation of a popular story told among the peasants of Gloucestershire concerning cowpox, a disease common to dairy cattle, characterized by the appearance of pustules on a cow's udders. Jenner published that the person who had been affected by cowpox was forever after secure from the infection of the smallpox. His book, entitled An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, a disease known by the name of cowpox, formalized the baptism of his theme in the very title, bequeathing to science a new entity called cowpox, or Variolae Vaccinae in Latin. The word vaccination would soon follow thanks to Richard Dunning, a surgeon in Plymouth who, with Jenner's assent, published in 1800 some observations on vaccination or the inoculated cowpox. But the great leap would come almost a century later when in 1881, Louis Pasteur announced at the Scientific Congress in England that he had found a cure for carbuncles, an animal disease, calling it vaccination. The Pasteurian strategy consisted of extending the list of performances attributed to Variolae Vaccinae, which in the rejuvenated Pasteurian version went from being the victor over a single disease, smallpox, to being the commander-in-chief in battles against a number of diseases, but synthetically renamed as vaccine, defined by Pasteur in 1881 as, quote, attenuated viruses having the characteristic peculiar to the generic vaccine that they never kill, but provide a benign disease that protects one from the fatal disease, unquote. This novelty, the inoculation of attenuated virus, was probably at the basis of vaccinations rejection. So you introducing me a disease to make me healthier? Well, obviously that if we could understand this rejection by the end of the 19th century, it's much harder to have the same comprehension by the beginning of 21st century. Pasteur did not attach great importance to the absence of a theory that would explain the success of a method that remained empirical. Therefore, although it had served as a model for Pasteurian science to advance in the production of vaccines against rabies, and carbuncles, the plague, etc., the fight against smallpox was by that time still shrouded in scientific ignorance. Nevertheless, the vaccine revolt involved an effort by the GSP physicians to formalize a discourse that redistributed the repository of knowledge, expropriating it from the popular wisdom that had co-authored Jenner's insight and reallocated it exclusively to scientists. Medical wisdom, cast as the polar opposite of popular wisdom, offers a glimpse of a new demarcation of borders between those who believe and those who know. Thus emerges what Bruno Latour calls a great divide between, on the one hand, human rationality protected by scientific objectivity, and on the other hand, the irrational subjectivity of men betrayed by their beliefs and passions. The irrational people were lured off the straight road of science by something. The asymmetric treatment of the revolt arises from the fact that the rational people assume that only the something that lure others from the straight road require explanation, while the straight road of supposedly rational knowledge is self-evident, requiring no explanation. All the attempts to explain the vaccine revolt examined here were formulated in terms of trying to understand a deviation from the straight path of scientific rationality. Another option is to continue following the scientists along this straight path, hoping to contribute to a techno-scientific narrative about the smallpox vaccine, thus vaccinating the vaccine revolt. The idea of a separation between science and society supports the hegemonic model of scientific production, the analysis of which can provide another understanding of the vaccine revolt. Bruno Latour calls it the diffusion model because it gives the impression that the circulation of techno-scientific objects is restricted to being passed along by a multitude of believers. Objects are seen as having a purely technical lineage, and they are not so much constructed as revealed, in that what is revealed, a microbe, a particle, a vaccine, has simply been extracted by someone from a stable and permanent reality, not to shape it, but simply to help it come to light, like Sleeping Beauty being awakened by the kiss of a prince. Of course, it is impossible for a single genius of humanity to single-handedly disseminate his or her discoveries and inventions. As Bruno Latour comments, quote, thousands of people are at work, hundreds of thousands of new actors are mobilized in these works, but only a few are designated as the motors that move the whole thing, unquote. He proposes that this, quote, diffusion model now invents a society as simply a medium of different resistance through which ideas and machines travel based on the principle of asymmetry. There is an appeal to social factors only when the true path of reason has been distorted, but not when it goes straight, unquote. The men of the GSP and their allies were surprised to find groups of resistors. After all, just a little bit of without slide. After all, the diffusion model portrays the users of technoscience as subjects who are willing to accept the efficiency of its products, which nevertheless do not move about on their own. So these products continue to need a long chain of mediations. According to that representation, these users would have to submit passively to the mediations entailing the vaccination campaign, starting with the very act of vaccination itself, which was by no means a simple matter. One of those doctors linked to the GSP wrote in the journal Brasil Médico that the vaccinator should take, quote, all the precautions that precede any surgical procedure, no matter how simple or commonplace it may seem, unquote. So the vaccinator, a character who had so far remained on the sidelines, takes on extraordinary importance in the description of the vaccination procedure, demonstrating that the diffusion of a technoscientific artifact requires the active, not merely passive, cooperation of increasingly extensive and heterogeneous collectives. In the hands of a bad vaccinator, the vaccination was no longer effective. The doctor's article described in minute detail a process that had all the complexity of a surgical procedure involving antiseptic preparation, a well-mixed vaccine, incisions that did not bleed, and followed a certain format, among other provisions, revealing that the act of vaccination had to follow a number of prescriptions, even if it was intended as a simple routine act. Vaccination, therefore, does not consist only of the abstract administration of a biological product tested and approved in a laboratory. Its administration necessarily involves the submission of thousands or millions of bodies that must somehow believe its promises. So, in that year of 1904, a diverse and heterogeneous population had to be taken into consideration, even if they were, as the police chief put it, the feces of society. The existence of citizenship had to be considered, and one can only imagine how difficult it was for the population to trust the actions of a state that had historically acted against the popular interest, and for an authoritarian slave-holding elite to take the concerns of poor people into consideration. So for this elite, therefore, the scientific fiction of the diffusion model fitted like a glove. In this sense, the vaccine revolt can be seen as resulting from the oppressive and authoritarian political practice of a model that was itself authoritarian, the diffusion model. So to conclude, assuming a popular revolt take its shape from the intense interaction of outside forces derived from the social and political context with the unpredictable and uncontrollable internal dynamics shown by rebels on the streets, the historiographical review of the vaccine revolt attempted here has sought to question its portrayal as a structure subjected to some sort of regulation. Instead, a more cautious and modest path was intended here to treat the structure as a rhizome, as a loosely connected ensemble, acting under complex and unstable circumstances, not captured by a reductionist analysis. The focus on Prata Preta served as a counterpoint to histories narrated from the top down and to emphasize the absence of the voice of Prata Preta, whose muting made it easier to construct allegories about the people, or portrayed as heroically opposing elite oppression, or conversely, anti-heroically cast as dangerous types. I also sought to highlight the issue of gender, adding to the silence of the muted characters, the absent voices of women, in whose name the call went out to resist by any means, even with force of arms, but from whose own mouths nothing was heard. Finally, this presentation treated the revolt as an episode equally relevant to the history of science and technology, summed up in the proposal to vaccinate the vaccine revolt, approaching it as a social technical history, moved by the fact that the vaccine, a techno-scientific artifact, gave its name to a popular revolt. That is why references were presented that intertwined the history of science with its sociology, mobilized especially by the concepts of the diffusion model and the critique of the Great Divide. It sought, in the midst of so many heterogeneities, to focus on a history without the problematic separations between science and society. I hope I made these points clear for you. And a final observation between then and now. Then we had the press, now we have social networks, which make a big difference. But this is the beginning of another discussion, so I'll stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kuckerman, for that wonderful presentation. It was very rich in its contextual, methodological, historiographical, and epistemological dimensions. So there was much for us to benefit from in that talk. I'm going to cluster together some questions in the interest of time. I'll also ask the audience to please post your questions so I can convey them to Professor Kuckerman. So the first two questions are, the first is from Susanna Sharp. She asked, both Brazil and the United States have seen resistance to the COVID vaccine among certain sectors of the population, weaponized and even fomented by Bolsonaro and the former US president. In this context, what is the extent of historical memory in Brazil about the 1904 vaccine revolt? Has this historical episode entered into current debates about the COVID vaccine in Brazil? Related question from Paloma Diaz. In the early 20th century, people didn't have the access to information that we have now. In the case of Brazil, given its size, information didn't travel even within the country as fast as now, when people can, in a few seconds, learn what is happening in other cities and other countries quickly. So now Brazilians, a century later, can learn what's going on about the pandemic and the effects of vaccination. Are Brazilians more willing to pay attention to global trends beyond what their president is telling them, or do they feel that their experience is too unique to be compared?
So the first question, Susanna Sharp's question. The vaccine revolt is almost always being reminded by the press and by all the sectors that oppose the president's and his government opposition to vaccine and their indications for early treatment. So I think it's a kind of example of a reaction that was not so beneficiary for the people. So I think it's a good example for the moment we are living now in Brazil. And about the second, I don't know if I answer it. I'm trying to be very, very concise. And the second question, I would say that just after the vaccine revolt, the GSP decided to print what they call advices to the people. So they began to understand that they should open a kind of dialogue with the people, no matter how the dialogue was to be made, but it was in their, they finally concluded that they could not impose as a kind of truth. The scientific truth should be accepted without any kind of dialogue, without any discussion. So, but in fact, during this century, I think that there was an education for vaccination. So today, all the people submit. We are having a very high rate of people submitting to vaccination. There is no popular resistance nowadays to vaccination. I think that the resistance is concentrated in government and some of its circles. Don't know if I answered both questions.
Well, actually, there's another question from the current chair, Fulbright chair in Brazilian studies at UT, Professor Teresa Cristina Marques. And it's related to that. She asked to what extent SUS, the federal health agency, has in 40 years campaigning for vaccination, has created a favorable environment for vaccination. But let me just modify that slightly, since you sort of answered that. I would ask you what accounts for their success? Because you kind of suggested that they have been more successful over preceding decades. So what would account for that greater success?
About the late, I didn't understand the last 40 years, that's the question.
Vaccination in Brazil.
Well, the campaigns became more and more well-planned. There is, so the children, they cannot go to school if they don't have this vaccination passport registered. And mainly the mothers, they perceived that the vaccination was beneficial for their children, especially polio vaccination. In the beginning of these vaccination campaigns, we eradicated polio in Brazil. So I think that there is much more comprehension that the vaccine is beneficial to whoever takes it. So that's the point. I think that there was, what counts for this success is a very good planning of vaccination campaigns. Brazil is one of the best in planning these campaigns. In the last 40 years, we had many vaccination campaigns against meningitis, polio, influenza, yellow fever. So everyone in Brazil is now, everyone, but most of the people is used to receive the calls from the government to adhere to vaccination campaigns. It has been an educational process, I would say so. People were educated to be vaccinated. that would be my answer.
What do you think the public health authorities learned specifically from the vaccine revolt of 1904? What do you think they learned in terms of messaging, public relations, convincing the population of the benefits of vaccine?
Well, I think I've already answered it in part. After the vaccine revolt was over, they began to, this circle of the GSP began to build a kind of dialogue through leaflets printed and distributed to the people. They made a massive distribution of leaflets to the people. We had about 600,000 inhabitants in Rio de Janeiro by the beginning of the century, and they printed almost 600,000 leaflets. So maybe they delivered these leaflets house by house, person by person. So I think that what they learned about it, that they should not impose scientific authority, but they should instead try to follow a kind of dialogical, I don't know if the term exists in English, or to promote the dialogue with population, to try to bring it to the frame of education and not imposition. I think that our governments had transformed vaccination campaigns in educational campaigns. So, for example, dengue, it's another disease which demands educational campaigns, not vaccination. You cannot leave water without regarding how the water is. It cannot be still water because it attracts the dengue mosquito. So we are very, very used to these campaigns. And I think this is the great lesson. Vaccination and public health is a matter of education, not of imposition, not of an order from the top down, but a practice that must be within the society. And also, the last governments, they had invested in family health. So we have a network of agents of family health that at least until before this government, but the agents of family health, they used to visit all the domiciles in the poorest areas and take care of the health of each family. So there is a presence, or there was a presence of the public health authorities together at the side of the people, even in the poorest areas. So this should be the answer, I believe.
Since you talked about, and we hear about, of course, the religious objections to contemporary vaccination, for the 1904 campaign, do we know about the role or the position of the Catholic Church regarding the mandatory vaccines?
Well, in fact, that's a good question. I didn't cross at the Catholic Church position during my research. I couldn't answer you precisely, but I think that they stayed in a kind of neutral position. They didn't endorse and they didn't fight against. And because they, Catholic Church in the beginning of the 20th century was for government, was pro-government. So they depended on the central power to continue to exist powerful in our country. So I'm not sure if I'm being right in my answer, but probably they stand at a kind of neutral position, not interfering and not supporting.
I had a question for you in terms of just a personal reflection, because being a historian of this era and of science technology and of this renowned incident in Brazil's history, how does it feel to see all of the controversy and the conflict surrounding the contemporary methods to fight COVID in Brazil?
Could you repeat? I didn't catch the point.
I said, as on a personal level, since you've researched this topic so extensively for the early part of the 20th century, and of course in your talk you made references to contemporary parallels or analogs, but I wanted to know how you feel when you come across some of the contemporary anti-vax arguments, having studied this in a historical perspective, how that sort of hits you on a personal level.
Well, first, kind of perplexity. As I commented, it's something very weird that even after 120 years of experience with vaccination, the arguments still continue. But I should emphasize something interesting. When we say science, we imagine an homogeneous block. And you should know that here in Brazil, there is part of the doctors, part of the Society of Doctors, do support the early treatment. They were in support of the early treatment. The Conselho Federal de Medicina, it's the Council for Medicine, the Federal Council for Medicine, is supportive to our government, to the public health of our government. And there are lots of doctors that they still recommend the chloroquine and ivermectin and azithromycin. So it's not a block. Science is not an homogeneous block where scientific wisdom is equally well kept, but there is controversy between our medical community still today, which makes me more perplexed at this happening. So I don't have a kind of explanation about where comes from this kind of opposition. It's something very weird for me. I cannot grab it and I cannot frame it in a kind of explanation that is enough to understand. That would be my answer. And try to have in mind, science is not an homogeneous block. So there are everywhere doctors that they are against. They have in mind that opposition to vaccination was held in part by very intellectuals and doctors and people that were very, very smart and still continue. These people still continue to oppose vaccination, and well, they are concentrated in the far right, okay, but they are here between us. So I think this is a kind of, it reminds me Italo Calvino. He has a book where he finishes the book, is the Imaginary Cities, and he says, well, the problem is not to say that the hell is gone. Hell is here, but what you have to know is to try to learn to differentiate hell from what is not hell. So science is not this paradise concentrating all the high minds. It's also, there are hells in the midst of a scientific community. We have an important immunologists and infectologists here that are for the early treatment, that supported the president for early treatment. So that's a point that makes the answer to your question still more difficult.
Well, I wanted to thank you, Professor Kuckerman, for this very enlightening and thought-provoking talk. And I wanted to thank the audience for tuning into this webinar. The Brazil Center at Lilas will have other lectures later this semester, so we hope that you'll attend those as well. And I wish that you all have a very great afternoon and hope to see you again in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the audience, and thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.